Hi, everyone. I'm Penny Gordon-Larson, and I'm pleased to be here on behalf of our session. This is a joint session with TOS and the European Association. So both of us, obesity associations, working together. And we had a really wonderful meeting when we were at our last TOS meeting and started to really come together, bring the two groups together in a much more meaningful way than we had before. So we talked a lot about science, and we built a session that we thought would be interesting and touch on many of the different areas of science that we're covering in terms of global obesity. So there's a couple of things I have to do that are business-wise. I am supposed to tell you that that you are not supposed to take pictures or film, and we will be having the session run as a set of the 5 speakers, and then we'll go to a discussion session. So in the discussion session, we'll all just come up at the end and allow people to have more in-depth questions. So we'll have time for a couple of questions in between each of the talks, but then we'll have a much greater discussion at the end. And I'll let each speaker, as they come up, take the questions from the audience, these, just 1 or 2 quick questions, and then we'll move to the next speaker. So in this session, I'll be speaking first, and I'll be talking about urbanization in China, and then John Speakman will speak about fast food restaurants and obesity, Ted Kyle on weight bias, Arnie Astrup on personalized diet management, and then we'll finish with Simone Barquer on regulatory efforts in Mexico and Chile. So I will go ahead and get started. So I'll be speaking about urbanization in China, and I'll touch on diet and omics and speak in relation to cardiometabolic disease. So I have no commercial conflicts. And the question that I'm asking in this talk today is really, how exactly does urbanization affect health? So we know that there's these well-documented urban-rural differences in cardiometabolic health and in obesity, but what's really less well known are how exactly urbanization-related factors impact health. So that's largely because there are gaps in methodologies that allow us to study these full pathways and look at the complexity, the direct and indirect relationships, to see how exactly urbanization relates to health outcomes. There's also been a fair amount of gaps in the breadth of data from molecular to behavior to environment levels. So bringing all of that together to really understand urbanization and health is critical. So we're doing just that in the China Health and Nutrition Survey, and this is a multi-stage random cluster drawn sample that we've been following for over 25 years. It's a very large sample, as you can see across the bottom. We're following folks from 1989 all the way to 2015, and we have around 20,000 people in the study. We originally drew from these 9 provinces that are here in the darker green, and it's a household-based survey, but we also have a very deep range of clinical and individual data, as well as household and community-level data on a range of economic, social, behavioral, and biological data. So China is characterized with this very rapid change in urbanization, and things unfold very quickly in China, and so we are fortunate in our study in the China Health and Nutrition Survey to be able to capture this dynamic change over time. And that change has been accompanied with an increase in BMI over time, and when we look at the effect of being a 40-year-old, say now in our younger cohorts, versus being a 40-year-old about 40 or 50 years ago, the average BMI at age 40 is about 1.5 units larger in our younger cohorts. So the younger cohorts are now being exposed to a higher BMI over a longer period of the life course than they ever have before. And that, of course, is going to have some major impacts down the road. There's also been a major change in the way people eat in China. So this is data from Barry Popkin looking across rural, small city, big city, and mega cities. And you can see that the proportion of foods coming from home-based meals really declines with urbanization. So in the megacities, our most developed areas, less than half of the food that people consume is coming from homemade foods in the house. And then the majority really is from processed foods or eating away from home. And all of those are usually less healthy, energy dense, higher in fat, different kinds of foods that are being consumed. So this rapid and uneven urbanization really unfolds differently across different parts of China. And you can't really capture this by saying, urban versus rural. So we've developed an urbanization index that takes into account the diversity of changes, sanitation, modern markets, traditional markets, the transportation infrastructure, education, economics, so forth. And so we look at those and we find that in many places, the kinds of urbanization changes are quite different. So you can get some areas that roads develop quickly and then followed by markets later. In other areas, markets may develop on the scene first and other kinds of factors later. And so we're teasing that apart and looking at the precise kinds of factors and how they might relate to health. And so just as an example here, this is looking at the odds of diabetes across these components of urbanization. And as you read down, you can see that for men, the odds of diabetes are higher with more modern markets, with communications, housing infrastructure, sanitation, economic activity, education, and education and income diversity. Whereas for women, we really only saw a higher odds of diabetes with sanitation. So obviously these can present some kinds of targets for us the more we know about them, and we're scratching the surface of this at this point in time. What we're aiming to do in the work that we're doing is really to look at these pathways and look at the complexity. We're using structural equation modeling, and this is a very simplified diagram here, but to really understand the pathways and how urbanization may bear its influence. So we take things like the community factors, and those are the urbanization-related factors, household factors, individual factors. And this is simplistic because you can have, for example, we can look at what is the effect of being low income in a highly urbanized community versus being low income. So it doesn't matter your income in the development of your community. And we can look at these, how these influence the behaviors related to obesity. And we can carry that out to body weight, and we can carry that out to an outcome like hypertension. And the interesting thing about these kinds of models is that we can look at the pathway from urbanization through behavior, more of an energy kind of pathway through body weight to hypertension, and we can take that apart and say, given that pathway, what is the direct pathway of diet, either diet patterns or sodium or any kind of nutrient that we might be interested. Similarly, we do the same for physical activity. And I'll show you an example of this. So this is one tiny little piece of that puzzle, and here we're looking at urbanization as it relates to BMI in 2009, as well as a change over 20 years in BMI. And here just breaking down caloric intake, Western diet, traditional diet, occupational and domestic activity. And again, we're looking at the effect of the level of that at the final period, but also the change over time. And when we look at this for urbanization to BMI, for diet, we can see that the urbanization pathway seems to be coming much more for the types of foods, the pattern of food that people eat, as opposed to purely energy intake. So there's something about the adoption of a modern high wheat kind of diet and the traditional Southern diet changes that relate to BMI. And we see the direct effect of caloric intake, but really over time, urbanization seems to be bearing an influence on the types of foods people consume. For physical activity, we see that urbanization seems to be operating through occupational activity and the changes in occupational activity to affect BMI. And so these dramatic changes here are carried through to BMI, and there's a direct effect of domestic activity, and this is for men. The findings in females are different, but just for brevity's sake, I'm showing this. So what happens at the molecular level underlying some of these changes? And so we can look at what's going on in the gut microbiome and in the metabolome to look at how some of these kinds of changes may influence what we see under the skin. And we're using, we've actually been collecting fecal samples and sequencing those samples. We have 10,000 stored samples in the study, which is really quite amazing, all over China for our sample. And so far we have about 5,000 sequenced, but I'm not going to show you those data now. I'm just going to show you a small portion of adults, 40 adults from Hunan province. And we picked this province because we wanted to get neighboring individuals, urban and rural adults who live close to each other, so they have the same kind of dietary traditions and exposed to kind of similar environments, and that the only things that differ are really the stage of development. We have fasting plasma metabolomics, and we have fecal samples collected 2 weeks apart. I'll show you today the 16S sequencing as well as the whole genome metagenome sequencing. And Anthony Fodor from University of North Carolina at Charlotte is really the mastermind behind this. He's amazing and has been a fabulous collaborator on the project. So here, just to show you that indeed these are really quite different areas in Hunan, very different in terms of their population, their income, birth rate, and so forth, and in the metadata. So you can see that they, the urban individuals already have higher insulin, waist circumference, BMI, and HbA1c. So this is a lot, but it's actually very simple. So this is showing you the, if we look across, this is going down the taxonomic levels to about here. And here showing the breakdown of the pattern of what's in the gut by the urban versus rural. So rural is in blue, and red is the urban, and basically what you're looking for is the distinction between these, where you see that the blues are together and the reds are together. And then next to each is a diversity index showing the diversity of the microbes in the gut. And so as you go down, you can see that they're really different, what is in the patterning of what's in the gut, as well as the diversity of those microbes. And when you look at the archaea and the viruses, and these we get with our whole genome metagenome, you can see that the profiles are very different for urban versus rural dwellers. So for urban, it's much less varied, and in fact, we see more of the deleterious viruses, and the reduction is probably due to antibiotic intake, which is much higher in the urban area. When we compare them to American populations, this is the Human Microbiome Project, and you can see that we find the same bugs in the urban and rural individuals, but we find much more diversity across the rural, and when you get to the prevalence, the urban have a much higher prevalence of the American kind of bugs. The metabolome also is similarly discriminatory here with the rural versus urban, and so this just shows that the circulating metabolites in the bloodstream are very different in urban and rural dwellers. And 10 of the 16 significantly different metabolites that we found were involved in lipid, carbohydrate, and energy metabolism, which of course are major features of an urban diet. And here, this is showing the amount of classification for urban versus rural that you can get, how well you can classify based only on some of these data. So I'll draw your attention to the metabolite and metadata, which is this light blue line. So if you only knew somebody's characteristics and their metabolome, you would be able to very easily identify if they were from a rural or urban environment. So the implications of this work is that we have very different microbiome and metabolome in recently urbanized and rural individuals from Hunan. And our findings really suggest a potential convergent evolution in the US and urban Chinese population. So we have very similar patterns of abundant microbes, probably through similar lifestyles on different continents. And the question we need to ask next is really, do these changes relate to changes that accompany urbanization, such as diabetes, obesity, inflammatory bowel disease, and cancers? And the next steps for us are to tie in these microbial and metabolomic data into those pathway models to see exactly how these factors are being influenced. So I'll end by thanking my collaborators from UNC, Barry Popkin, who is at the meeting but not here at the moment, Linda Adair, Annie Green Howard, Elizabeth Kaler, and then folks from UNC Charlotte, Anthony Fodor, Wei Xia, and Catherine Wingley, as well as our Chinese collaborators, Drs. Wang, Zhang, and Ding, and Feng Yang, and our collaborators from Penn, Drs. Wu and Drs. Li, and our funders, NIDDK, NICHD, and NHLBI. So thank you. And I have time to answer one or two quick questions. Any questions? Well, if there's no questions, we can move to the next speaker, which is John Speakman. And he is going to be speaking about fast food and obesity.